When it comes to Philadelphia, you could be a Flyers fan, you could be a Sixers fan, you could be a Phillies fan, but really in the heart of this city, it is Eagle-centric, it bleeds green, and that's why we can't stay away from Eagles talk for too long. Last week, we took a week off from the Eagles. We talked all three of the other major sports teams in the city. We've got to get right back on this Eagles bandwagon right here on Trust the Podcast. I'm Tyler Zulli saying thank you so much for coming and joining with me today as we break down some big news around the Philadelphia Eagles. Later, we will talk to a good friend of mine, a guest, a Sixers insider, and we'll get some more Sixers action. And we'll talk some college sports as well. We'll get into the NCAA tournament as it's about to heat up with the conference tournaments going on right now. We'll also talk some college football as well, as one of my favorite guys and one of a lot of people's favorite guys, kind of their darling of the Combine, Sacrum Barkley, had an unbelievable day at the Combine. So we'll get to him as well in a little bit. But thank you once again for joining episode 6 of Trust the Podcast. Once more, I'm Tyler Zulli. Let's dive right into this Eagles talk. Because, like I said, we can't stay away from it too long. And a good friend of mine and a man you've heard on these airwaves before, Jeff Mosher, broke a story today that said the Philadelphia Eagles are being offered by at least one AFC team a second-round pick for Super Bowl MVP and backup quarterback Nick Foles. Now, I know we talked about this at a previous juncture, and I said that Nick Foles' value is never going to be as high as it is at this current moment leading up to the NFL draft in the end of April. But I also said that I would not take anything less than a first-round pick for Nick Foles simply because of his value and his asset ability, or his ability to be an asset to this Philadelphia Eagles team with Carson Wentz in limbo, with his health in flux, with it being up in the air. If Carson Wentz were 100% healthy and was able to start week 1, no questions asked, he was just going to be your number one first day, everyday starter, that would be a trade that I would make every single day of the week. However, when you talk about the current situation of the Eagles and the particular situation that they're in, Nick Foles' value is such that I was saying that he needs to be offered, the Eagles need to be offered a first-round pick or more in order to trade Nick Foles away because of the uncertainty of Carson Wentz and the status of Week 1 of the 2018 season. This isn't a team that's looking to rebuild. They're not in a process of winning 4 games and they're trying to get better, and Nick Foles would bring assets back to this team. It's a team that is trying to continue to be a Super Bowl contender. It's a team that just won the Super Bowl and is looking to find ways to get back while being cash-strapped. With Donnie Jones retiring this past week, the Eagles are still about $9 million over the cap, and they have to get under that number in the next 10 days or so. And Nick Foles, a trade for Nick Foles, or a trading Nick Foles, is not going to get them under that number because of his contract incentives and all that kind of good stuff. So that's a different issue. But it would alleviate some contractual obligations for next season should the Eagles find a way to trade Nick Foles. So really the question becomes, I said it earlier a couple weeks ago that I wouldn't take anything less than a first-round pick for Nick Foles. But now you look at it, and you look at a Philadelphia Eagles team that has pick number 32 and then will not pick again until the 4th round. Will not pick again for over 90 picks, or almost 90 picks. There is going to be a lot of talent that comes off the board from pick 32 to their first pick in the 4th round. And the discrepancy between pick 32, whomever they take, or trade out of that pick, and who they take on day 3, the talent level is going to be starkly different. Because that's just the reality of how the landscape of the draft works. So do you grab that second-round pick and say, well, Carson Wentz may not be ready, but we have a second-round pick now, and you have to remember that Sidney Jones is probably going to play for a full season, which really means you have 2 second-round picks in this draft because he's going to be not a rookie, but he'll be playing in his first season. So he'll be in his rookie year despite being a year 2 guy. So now the jump from 32 to whatever pick you get in the second round, be it pick 47 from the Arizona Cardinals, be it pick whatever pick it may be. Now your discrepancy between second round and fourth round is filled, or first round and fourth round is filled with at least another qualified player. Now, does that mean I would take the deal immediately? No, I don't think so. Because as I've said, Nick Foles is most valuable to the Philadelphia Eagles as a Philadelphia Eagle. Now, is it going to be 2 first-round picks like Bill Polian said? Absolutely not. That guy is, I think, past his prime at this point, a little bit off his rocker. For him to say that you would shut the door and slam the phone down for anything less than 2 first-round picks, I think that's asinine. That's not crazy. That's not, wow, that's a bold statement. That is utterly asinine to say that the Eagles are going to get 2 first-round picks for Nick Foles. But I don't know if I'm ready to pull the trigger yet on a second-round pick alone, despite the fact that the Eagles don't have a pick on day 2. They don't have a pick in the second or third round, and that gap would shrink between picks. I get that. But Nick Foles' value has at least doubled by being a Super Bowl MVP. So let's take a look at some of the teams that could have been the quote-unquote mystery team that our good friend Jeff Mosher said from the AFC offered the Philadelphia Eagles at least a second-round pick for Nick Foles. And by the way, before we get into this, word on the street is that Chris Mortensen, another big NFL insider, said that he would not take anything less than a first and a fourth-round pick for Nick Foles, which coincidentally is what the Eagles got for Sam Bradford a few seasons ago. So he wouldn't take anything less than a first and a fourth, which brings down a little bit the craziness of Bill Polian. And I agree more so with Chris Mortensen than I do with Bill Polian, because I think 2 first rounds is never going to happen. But a first and a fourth, that's a different story. That is where I get into the realm of let's make this deal happen. To get a first and a fourth, especially in this year's draft. If the fourth comes next year and you get the first this year, that's fine. If you get both in the 2018 season, that's even better, because you can replace veteran expensive talent for maybe a guy that you could get onto the field for extremely cheap. But the one thing that has to stay, the one consistency that has to stay in that trade is the first-round pick being a pick this year. Now, of course, that's if they get the deal done prior to April 26th. But if they get that deal done prior to April 26th, which, by the way, is still a month and a half away, you still have upwards of 6 or 7 weeks to make that deal before the draft begins. If that first-round pick is in 2018, it's this April, then I'm making the move. I'm making the move right now. But let's get back to that second-round offer. And the team was not announced as to which team was willing to make a deal for Nick Foles for that second-round pick. But here are a couple of thoughts. The Buffalo Bills come to mind as a team that might be willing to offer a second-round pick for Nick Foles, because they have 2 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks in this year's draft. They also have the Eagles' third-round pick for the trade they made for Ronald Darby, acquiring Jordan Matthews and a third-round pick. So the Bills have a plethora of picks, one of which in that second round they could use to trade for Nick Foles while they use Nick Foles to cultivate another quarterback. Because the Tyrod Taylor era in Buffalo is clearly over, despite the fact that they do not have an incumbent quarterback to play the game right now. Because all I needed to see out of Nathan Peterman was 30 minutes of football to realize that he is not a starting quarterback in the NFL, and he really might not be a backup quarterback in the NFL. He threw 5 picks in that game in the first half. We all know how that went down. It was a terrible decision by Sean McDermott. And had the Bills missed the playoffs this season, which it was not a guarantee that they would make the playoffs until the final Sunday, I would have fired Sean McDermott immediately for starting Nate Peterman in that game because you can't come back from 5 interceptions and a half. So maybe it's the Buffalo Bills who are looking to start fresh at the quarterback position but aren't in a position draft-wise to get one of the big 3 guys. And the big 3 guys being Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen, Baker Mayfield. Now here's the thing in the Bills' spot. Josh Allen could fall. Josh Allen, you can maybe even put him into a big 4 because he's got that cannon for an arm. And apparently he impressed at the Combine, which, by the way, if you watch the Combine, I know he threw the ball 70 yards in the air, and that's utterly impressive. You know who else threw the ball 70 yards in the air routinely? Jamarcus Russell. How'd he pan out? Josh Allen's throws didn't look good. His arm looked great. His throws didn't look good. Josh Rosen looked far better. Now, I have a man crush on Josh Rosen. I think he's ready to step in and be a day one quarterback, especially if he's going to go to a team like the New York Giants, who have weapons, just don't have an offensive line. He could even sit behind Eli Manning for a year and learn, allow the Giants to maybe not be good again next year, and then draft a big-time offensive lineman. But the Bills are a situation where they're not going to be able to draft one of those 4 guys. Now, of course, Lamar Jackson may be a back-end first-day guy that they might want to look at, but clearly in the offense that they ran, Tyrod Taylor wasn't getting it done. And I put air quotes up. You can't see them clearly because all you hear is my voice. But Tyrod Taylor, quote-unquote, wasn't getting it done. Now, I don't know if that was statistically or on the field or leadership-wise, because if you look at the box score every week, Tyrod Taylor was getting it done. They weren't scoring a lot of points around him, but he had some good play. So it could be the Bills. Maybe it's the Denver Broncos, who are not going to give up that first-round pick, which is early in the top 10, midway through the top 10, but are seemingly going to miss out on the Kirk Cousins sweepstakes. And maybe it is the Broncos who are willing to give up that early second-round pick to the Philadelphia Eagles so that the Eagles would pick something along the lines of 32 and 40. Because now at 32 and 40, you could do one of 2 things. You could draft 2 very quality players because, in my opinion, the top 50 should all be starters right away. Unless you're a team like the Patriots who draft just best player available every single year, and you get a guy at a wide receiver spot or you get a guy at defensive tackle spot that's not quite ready to be a starter, everybody within the top 50 should be a starting caliber player on whatever team that they get drafted to. So now you have 2 starters within the top 40 picks, and you only have to pay one of them first-round talent, or first-round money. Or, option B, you take 32 and you take 40 and you find a way to creep up a little bit in the first round. That puts guys like Roquan Smith back into consideration. He's not going to be there at 32. He might be there at 15. Now, I know that kid from Boise State, Vander Esch or whatever his name is, has lit up people's minds recently. But is he the same player as Roquan Smith? I don't think so. And the difference between them is 1 and 3 in linebacker consideration. So you have the potential to maybe move up. You have the potential to have 2 picks in the top 40. Maybe the Broncos are the team. Maybe it's the New York Jets, who are in a similar situation as the Denver Broncos, who seem to be losing out on the Kirk Cousins sweepstakes. And by the way, these 2 teams appear to be losing out on Kirk Cousins to the Minnesota Vikings. And I think Cousins would be a fantastic fit in Minnesota because Keenum played extremely well. Bradford played extremely well in a system that doesn't require you to take a ton of shots downfield. It just requires you to complete the passes that you need to complete. And that was because they had quarterbacks that weren't really playmakers. They were game managers. Kirk Cousins, while not the elite echelon playmaker, is a bigger playmaker than either of those 2 guys. So if you bring Kirk Cousins into the fold, Minnesota could very well likely be back in the NFC title game next year. So maybe it's the New York Jets who are offering that second-round pick for the services of Nick Foles. The Jets also have 2 second-round picks. They have their own, which also, I believe, falls within the top 10, maybe the top 12. So again, now the Eagles are looking at 32 and 40, 32 and 42, whatever it may be. Now you have 2 substantial picks in the top 40-something picks. And finally, maybe it's the Cleveland Browns. Maybe the Browns are looking to get a guy like Nick Foles with their second-round pick, one of their 3 second-round picks, by the way, while they draft a quarterback in the top 4 with their 2 top 4 picks, and let Nick Foles be the guy this year while the quarterback develops, while Sam Darnold develops, while Baker Mayfield develops, while Josh Rosen develops, while Josh Allen develops. Let Nick Foles be the guy for 1 season, maybe 2 seasons if you sign him to an additional year extension, and then you turn the reins over to Sam Darnold. Then you turn the reins over to Josh Allen. And that might be a good way that the Cleveland Browns could go. Because if you do that, you're going to get a quarterback at 4. I don't think that the Browns need to draft a quarterback at 1. You might not get your guy, but there's going to be a guy there in the top 4. Because unless the Colts shock everybody, they're not taking a quarterback. Therefore, it comes down to you, the Giants, and you. So don't outbid yourself at 1 for a quarterback you can get at 4. Because like I said, unless the Colts make a shocking move and draft a quarterback to replace Andrew Luck, they're not taking a quarterback. So why not take a chance on a guy like Sacrum Barkley at 1? Or why not take a chance at a guy like Quentin Nelson at 1, shore up your offensive line, then get your quarterback at 4? Because I thought the perfect scenario for the Browns would be throw a ton of money at Kirk Cousins, draft Sacrum Barkley at 1, and then either get Quentin Nelson at 4 or a guy like Minkah Fitzpatrick at 4 and shore up your defense as well. But it seems like the Browns are not on that Kirk Cousins sweepstakes any longer, as it appears that it's going to be the Minnesota Vikings. So if you're the Browns, why not trade for a quarterback with a second-round pick, of which, again, you have 3, including pick 33? Why not trade for Nick Foles with 33? That gives the Eagles 32 and 33. And again, it's going to give you 2 starting players for Nick Foles. Now, the real question becomes, because we just spent 10 minutes talking about suitors, the real question becomes, if you trade Nick Foles for a second-round pick, even if it's pick 33, you are still tasked with getting a quarterback into Philadelphia that is comfortable with Doug Peterson, that is comfortable with the system, that is comfortable with being a backup once Carson Wentz is healthy, and that is relatively cheap because the Eagles are on a salary cap budget. So you have a lot to consider, because I know that the Eagles are very high on Nate Sudfeld. I know that they love Nate Sudfeld, and that's the reason they did not go out and get a backup quarterback when Carson Wentz went down. They just rode with Foles and Sudfeld. And we lost our collective minds. We freaked out that the Eagles were not going to get another quarterback. And what happens if Nick Foles gets hurt? What happens if Nick Foles can't play? Nate Sudfeld's going to have to come in and play. So clearly the Eagles like the guy. So what it really comes down to is, if the Eagles are willing to part ways with Nick Foles for a second-round pick, or even if it becomes a first-round pick, the issue is going to become getting a backup quarterback or a starting caliber quarterback that could play for the first couple of weeks until Carson Wentz is ready. And not just play, but compete and win. Now, I'm not looking for 6-0 or 8-0 or 7-1. If Carson Wentz were to miss 6 games, whomever they bring in to be the guy for 6 weeks is going to have to be somebody that can go 3-3. I'm not looking for 6-0 or 5-1. I just want 3-3. Because if you get 3-3 and you've got 10 games of Carson Wentz, I am convinced that Carson Wentz could still go 7-3, despite having no preseason, despite having no play in the first 6 weeks. Carson Wentz could go 7-3, could get you to 10-6, and get you back into the playoffs. And at that point, you've got a healthy, fully loaded Carson Wentz ready to go, and had only played 10 games. So he's not as riddled with nicks and scrapes and injuries because he's only played 10 instead of 16. So you have to get a guy that's able to keep you afloat at 500 for 6 weeks, for 4 weeks, for 8 weeks, whatever it is. Because if it's 4 weeks and they go 2-2, I know that Carson Wentz can go 8-4. If it's 6 weeks, I know that Carson Wentz could go 7-3. If it's 8 weeks, maybe I'm not so convinced that Carson Wentz could go 6-2 because he's going to come back rusty. 6-2 is a tall task over the second half of the season when you have to play a lot of divisional games. But at least this quarterback, whomever it may be, keeps them above water and floating. And that's what I want Nick Foles to be. And if it's not Nick Foles via the trade, that's what I need this guy to be, is somebody that could keep them afloat for 4 weeks, for 6 weeks, for 8 weeks, whatever it may be. So maybe you go out and you get a guy like Teddy Bridgewater, who would be cheap, who would understand that he's going to get a chance to fight for the starting job right away for the first 6 weeks of the season. Because for a guy like Teddy Bridgewater to be an Eagle for a 1-year deal and basically show the world that he could still play the quarterback position, start for 6 weeks, hand the reins over to Carson Wentz, sit the bench and be a viable backup for the next 10-plus weeks, and then go back and become a starting caliber quarterback. Go get paid somewhere else. That would be an ideal situation for a guy like Teddy Bridgewater who's looking to prove that he can still play at the NFL level. So that's what I would go and do. Would I make the move right now? Not yet. Not quite just yet. Because I want to see how the Kirk Cousins fiasco plays out. Because Kirk Cousins sets the market for everybody else. Kirk Cousins is the guy that's going to get $30 million. That sets the standard for every other quarterback. That sets the standard for Case Keenum. It sets the standard for Teddy Bridgewater. It sets the standard for Sam Bradford. It sets the standard for even guys that are fringe starters like Josh McCown. And then you make your move. You make your move based on that. And if it's still a second-round pick in April, and you know that Carson is progressing to a point where he's going to miss 5 games, 6 games, I'd roll the dice. I know that I said a couple of weeks ago that I wouldn't take anything less than a first-round pick, but at this point, I'd roll the dice because you need picks. You don't have a second, you don't have a third. And you picked 32, which means 31 of the best players are going to be gone by the time that your name gets called. So maybe take a shot at trading Nick Foles for a second-round pick. Thank you to Jeff Mosher for breaking that news for us. Thank you to Chris Mortensen for kind of relaying us some context on what he would do as the Eagles GM and taking a first and a fourth. If you have your opinion, would you trade Nick Foles for a second-round pick, or would it require more in order to get the job done? What I would like you to do is, if you're watching this or listening to this on PhillySportsNetwork.com, find a way to leave a comment below. You can also tweet at me at Tzul34. That's TZULL34. You can find me on Twitter. You can find us on Twitter at Philly Sports Network as well. Let me know if you think that a second-round pick is enough for the services of Nick Foles, or you're hanging on to him unless it's an offer that blows you away. Let me know what you think. If you're listening to us on YouTube, remember to leave a like, comment, and subscribe down below. That comment could be, yes, trade Nick Foles if you get a second. No, don't trade Nick Foles. You're absolutely crazy. I don't want to hear from you anymore. Keep Nick Foles. The Eagles need him. He's a Super Bowl caliber MVP, or Super Bowl MVP, guy that just won the Super Bowl for the Eagles for the first time in franchise history. So either way, let me know what you think. Thanks for tuning into the first segment. We're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we're going to be joined by a special guest to talk some Sixers hoops and other great basketball action from around the college spectrum. So you don't want to miss that. Keep hanging in. This is Trust the Podcast. Welcome back to another segment of Trust the Podcast, and now we are going to trust the process as we're joined by a guy that there is very few that I would rather talk Sixers hoops with. Sixers insider, 97.5 The Fanatic, a guy that has very involuntarily kind of become a mentor to me, but I thank him every day for all the help that he provides me. Mr. Devon Givens. Devon, thanks so much for joining us here on Trust the Podcast.
Tyler, we are not trusting the process because I was never a big fan of it. But, things are working out that Sam Hinkie did in a lot of good ways. So I guess you're right. Thanks for having me, Ty. I really appreciate it. This is cool.
Well, and it's kind of funny because a buddy of mine came up with this name and posed it to me. And I, like yourself, really not a big process guy. I'm more for let's win now.
Traditional, build it how you build it. And I know there was a loophole, and they found a way. Sam Hinkie was smart in that way. And you see a lot of teams trying to emulate what he did. And some argue, there was just a report, as a matter of fact, on I think it was either Bleacher Report or ESPN, one of the two, where they were trying to figure out, they had questioned a lot of GMs and executives around the league. Did it work or did it not work? So this is going to go on for quite some time. You look at Embiid and Simmons and Sharch and now Markelle Fultz. Then you go to the Michael Carter-Williams, Nerlens Noel, and Jahlil Okafor kind of thing. And we all know, but it's all about how you feel, if it worked or not. Are they in a good spot? Most people feel they are in a good spot, so I'm not going to say it.
And I think that for those that did trust the process, this is for them. And obviously all of us as Sixers fans want to see the conclusion be a championship.
Yeah.
But for those that continue to sit through and talk about the Tony Roten days and the Hollis Thompson days, and I think this one's for them a little bit more.
The only thing that I don't like, and I've said this plenty of times, is when the people who agree with it act as if people like yourself and myself, that we can't look at this team in the same eyes as they do because we did not agree that this was the right approach to go about to fixing this basketball team. There's not necessarily a right approach. We don't have to agree all the time on that's fandom.
Sure.
Even if you do root for the same team. We just got finished talking. I know you did, your Nick Foles segment, and we've talked about it on the station quite a bit. Some agree that you move them. Some say you don't. And it's all about the same common thing, getting that next Super Bowl, right? Getting that right quarterback under center, making sure your guy is healthy. So it's a weird thing with fandom where Sam Hinkie has separated the Sixers fandom, right? Where now it's two different sides. It's amazing.
And the end goal is all that really matters.
Yeah,
to win
exactly. It's the championship. No matter how you got there, if it worked, it worked. But it's all about the end result, which is the title.
So let's talk about the team that is significantly closer to the end result than those teams of the past.
Sure.
This team drops one of the Bucks last night, 118-110. They're still in a decent spot, as you mentioned, 34-28. You were a guy that had them winning somewhere in the high 30s, low 40s.
38-40.
I agreed with you on that. It seems that they're going to eclipse that expectation from both of us. But at times, there are times when you look at this team and they can be frustrating because they lead the league in turnovers. They turn the ball over almost 18 times a game. And then there are times where you go, my goodness, Embiid and Simmons on the court at the same time are a problem. And they're going to be a problem for a long time.
Right.
How do you get this team to more of that and less of the 18 turnovers a game?
More of that consistently. First, I think what we've noticed is on the road, the number goes up turnover-wise. At home, as you pointed out, these guys collectively, they play better, they protect the basketball, what have you, and they get better results. So you're right. And I really think, Ty, that it comes along with being seasoned, if you will. I kind of think the playoffs help them in that manner because they're going to know that they have to value the basketball. Not to say that it will happen, but it's something that they're going to learn from. J.J. Redick knows it as a veteran. Amir Johnson, Jarrett Bayless, these players, Marco Belinelli, Ersan Ilyasova, they know it. That said, they are culprits of turning the ball over themselves because they're asked to do things that they maybe normally would not be asked to do. With that said, they have their number of games where they do turn the ball over at a high rate. Then they have them when they do protect the ball like we had last week where they had 2 games of 10 and 12 turnovers, which was fantastic. It was great to see that. So I think it's just going to come with and it's funny for us to say it because we're talking about a team that's already 62 games into the season, but they are still young. I hate saying it, but they are still young. They are learning how to win, and the ultimate time to figure part of that out will be in the playoffs when they look at the box score and they lost 95-90 because they turned the ball over 20 to 23 times. Brett Brown is going to hammer that. And if they're down 2-1 in the series, you're going to hammer that and say, you lost because of this. So going into the playoffs, because I still think they make it, I'm sure you do as well.
Sure, absolutely.
That's when it's really going to hit them, if it already hasn't hit them yet, that in the postseason, this is when they really figure it out and say, okay, we have to protect the basketball.
Well, and you mentioned the postseason and the home aspect of that, and I want to get to that in a little bit because I think that's a big driving factor for this team and their success.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing you did mention were guys like Marco Belinelli and Ersan Ilyasova, who were both guys that had choices to come to teams that they wanted to play for, and they both chose the 76ers. And we know that Marco Belinelli said one of the reasons he wanted to come was because he trusted the process. And I know that's kind of the cliche thing to say at this point, but it has to have some kind of value, I would think, to have two veteran guys that have choices of where they want to go, and they pick Philadelphia.
It goes to the talent that Embiid and Simmons possess. That's what it all comes down to. And now that we look at them as a 34-win team after 62, and you look at what could be, that's why they chose this destination as their eventual home for the next couple of weeks. That's why, because of those two star players, those two young players in their fourth and first years in the NBA. This is why. This is why, because of those two and how good they are and what it says to the rest of the NBA of how they feel. Now, we're talking about two different players, but we know about the one name that everybody's going to be focused on in the summer.
Of course.
Right. So that's what it's all about, man. It's all about these two young players, building around them, and the acceleration of the growth of this basketball team as a whole for veterans like Ilyasova and Belinelli, knowing that their services were wanted elsewhere with more respected and teams that have already done it. Oklahoma City, San Antonio, Cleveland, names like that. Milwaukee, even though they've been in like the last 3 years, Milwaukee, Ilyasova having a history there, being on that team in his past years. So it just shows the growth of this team overall, the accelerated nature of this basketball team as to where they are right now and why two players like that decided to come here versus going elsewhere.
And the guy that we shall not name because June is a long, long way away. But we know who it is.
We know.
And he may be the fruition, the end goal of this whole buildup. But two guys like this who were very, very serviceable players. We saw, Belinelli in his first game against the Heat drop, I think it was 17.
17 off the bench.
And Ilyasova looked pretty sharp in his first game last week. So, they're two guys that they're not your marquee names, but they're two guys that have some clout to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they serve a purpose. They're veterans. They've been there. In Belinelli's case, he's won a championship with the San Antonio Spurs. So they've been there. They understand what it takes to win. And they've looked and projected. First of all, you know what it's all about when you sign as a buyout person or sign as a free agent. It's about the time. How much time am I going to get? And they looked at this roster and said, you know what? Whatever they have on that bench, while we accept them as teammates and we're going to root for them, we know we're going to come in and get minutes because the general manager told us so. The head coach told us so. When you step in here, you're going to play. There are minutes to be played for you, and hopefully they're going to be played down the stretch in the playoffs. So good pickups by the Sixers. They will pay dividends at some point. You just want them to do what they do and not try to do too much. Well, it might hurt the team.
So let's talk playoffs. They're 34-28, like we mentioned. 20 games left to play. They go 10-10, they get in.
44.
44 surely gets them in. But the Eastern Conference is a little bit convoluted as you've got the Cleveland Cavaliers at 3, the Miami Heat at 8, and all are separated by 3 and 4 and 5 games. There are 5 teams that are in a jumbled mess of a game and a half of each other. And you and I talked about this earlier today. The Pacers and the Bucks square off tonight. should the Bucks win that game, you've got 4 teams, all within a game of each other.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing.
So where exactly is the ceiling of this Sixers team? Is it the 3 seed, or is it somewhere a little bit further back?
I wouldn't jump 3 seed. I would jump 4 seed is the highest possible, because they've already shown that they can put themselves based on the numbers that are there. Yes, Cleveland is where they are, but they're going to win games because LeBron James is LeBron James. When it comes down the stretch, he's going to separate himself where he's in that top 3. Then there's 4 on out. Whether it's 4 through 9, 4 through 10, whatever it might be, that's what it's going to be. So I think that the max number that they can get to is the 4 seed between themselves, the Washington Wizards, the Milwaukee Bucks. I think that's in the Indiana Pacers.
Sure.
We left them out. That's where it's really going to come down to. They can get no higher than 4, in my opinion. And that's a darn good start for this basketball team, as we're saying, accelerating to what they are right now so quickly.
Would totally agree with that. And if they get the 4 seed, and we talked about how important and how much better they've been at home. Mm-hmm. The 12-game winning streak at the Wells Fargo Center. 13 now, I apologize. You're correct. 13 wins now at the Wells Fargo Center straight. So if they get the 4 seed, they would eventually draw the 5 seed, whichever team it may be. They get games 1 and 2 at the Wells Fargo Center. How important would those games be for this Sixers team to, you go up 1-1, you go in 1-1, or you go up 2-0? That's tough to come back from.
Sure. And you're looking at a 7-game series where it's 2-2, 1-1-1. That game 7, if it should get to that game 7, it's super important to have that home court advantage. So that's what you shoot for. That's what every team aspires to be in one of those top 4 spots, to make sure they hold that. Because playing at that center, the way that the crowd is on top of you, and Joel Embiid encouraging, and TJ McConnell also encourages the fans to really raise the level not only of the play, but scare the heck out of the other team because of how much they're on them. It's an amazing atmosphere, Ty. And I mean, when you're down there for the playoffs, and there's been a lot of playoff-like atmospheres this season, being down there in the 2012 years with the Iguodala, Lou Williams, Drew Holiday-led teams, it's a fun place to be when you're in the playoffs and they're winning. So critical to have those first 2 at home, having that home court advantage, knowing that you can go to Washington, Milwaukee, Indiana at Game 3 up 2, feeling very good about trying to steal one there and then come back for Game 5 and closing it out.
Well, and it's kind of funny. You could see my face kind of beaming a little bit as you were saying that, and it's tough to separate yourself as a fan and as somebody who covers the team when you have a situation like this where we find the Sixers in a peculiar spot where, like you said, it could be up 2-0 going into Game 3. You steal a game on the road, and all of a sudden you got a 3-1 lead. It's not a lock. Nothing's a lock in sports, but that's almost as close to one as you could find.
Sure, and the one thing that you always hear about teams that have a lead on the road or at home, no matter where it is, they always say how the closeout game is always the toughest. So if you're going to have one, have it at home.
Sure.
Why not?
You get at least the benefit of your home crowd.
No question.
And like you said, Joel Embiid is the kind of guy that feeds off the energy. The energy feeds off him, it seems like. And he steps that game up when he knows either they're on a national scale, whether it be on TNT or ESPN,
they're going to be
or
on
their home.
There won't be a lot of NBA TV games. They're going to be on ESPN, ABC, or TNT. That's what it is.
It's going to be fun to watch. So let's kind of dive into these playoff matchups, and then I'll let you go because I don't want to keep you too long.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any matchups, you mentioned Indiana, Milwaukee, Washington. Are there really any matchups that excite you? That you think that the Sixers
I'll stop you right there. Washington.
Go ahead.
Washington. I love that matchup because I think they simply match up man for man very well against the Washington Wizards. Because of, I'm not disrespecting Bradley Beal, Otto Porter, and John Wall. We know who they are. Although people need to know that I can't stand John Wall, I don't disrespect him and say he's not a top player in the league. That said, Washington is playing really well without him. If you would say that they're going to play better, that would be foolish. Embiid is the ultimate neutralizer, in my opinion. He will give Marcin Gortat fits when he gets him in foul trouble.
And Gortat's a physical defender.
He is, and that's why he's going to get in foul trouble. And when he comes out, Ian Mahinmi, he's going to get himself in foul trouble because they simply cannot guard him. I will bleed all of Embiid out and let everything go through him to, first of all, get them in that foul issue that they're going to have, and then work off of that. So I like that matchup there. Otto, Porter, Covington. Porter's better. Shooting guard, J.J. Redick, Bradley Beal, better. As much as John Wall is a better player than Ben Simmons, I think I expect Ben Simmons to ramp it up in the postseason. So just simply looking at that matchup and how they play against them and how they have played them in the past, I simply like them the most out of all the teams against the Washington Wizards because they're so susceptible to being a bad team because as good as John Wall is, they're susceptible to being a bad team because of who John Wall is also.
Sure. So to wrap this up a little bit, do the Sixers have to be the 4 seed or the 5 seed, whether either or, to play a team like Washington?
If it was Indiana, I would say you're okay at the 5. Little disrespect to them, my bad, because they would have earned that 4th spot. But
I don't think there's any disrespect. This is a touted Sixers team.
Sure,
at this point.
It is. Against the Wizards, you do want to have home court. Mm-hmm. You do. But I do think they can go in Washington and win because they have. They have shown that they can play well there. Last game against Washington got out of hand. But I do think that they match up the best against the Washington Wizards, in my opinion.
I think that game kind of got out of hand because I don't think Kelly Oubre missed.
Exactly.
Lighting the world on fire.
And they're not going to shoot like that again. Now, maybe Otto Porter might, and Bradley Beal certainly can, and John Wall as well. But for Kelly Oubre to go crazy the way he did, specifically from behind the arc, I just don't see that consistently happening in a 7-game series.
So as we wrap it up here, let's switch it up a little bit. Give you one fun question before we get out of here. We talked about it in the first segment. What's the bare minimum to trade Nick Foles?
The bare minimum? 2 twos.
2 twos.
There it is.
Sixers Insider, 97.5, the Fanatic host. Just an all-around good guy. Devon Givens, thanks so much for stopping by and talking some Sixers hoops. And 2 twos is the minimum for Nick Foles.
2 twos. I love the podcast, man. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. We're going to take a break, step aside for a little bit. On the other side, we'll get to some college sports, both hoops and football. You're listening to Trust the Podcast. You know, I don't buy a whole lot of stock into the NFL Combine. It's just something that never really sat well with me because it's a bunch of guys that are running around in shorts and T-shirts, running some routes with no coverage, throwing footballs with no pressure, jumping, running straight lines. It just doesn't do it for me like a Senior Bowl would or a Senior Bowl game or something along those lines, the East-West game. Something about this combine is kind of misconstrued to me because people take a lot of stock into combine numbers. Well, he ran a quick 40. His vertical wasn't great. He benched the 225 this amount of times. It really just doesn't resonate with me because it doesn't really translate to the ability on the field. Welcome back into the final segment of this episode of Trust the Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Zulli. Thanks so much for joining us today, as you do every week. I hope, if this is the first time joining us, well, welcome, and we hope you stick around for more. If you've listened to some or all of the Trust the Podcast episodes since we began this little endeavor, well, thank you so much for coming back and finding us once more. Like I said, I don't buy into combine numbers too much, but when there are eye-popping numbers that get put out, think Cyrus Jones in the jump that put him in a first-round talent pool when he really wasn't a first-round talent. You have to take a look at them and be amazed. And what Sacrum Barkley did at the NFL Combine this past week was nothing short of spectacular. The guy put up 29 reps on the bench press, which the statistic that everybody's using that I don't buy as much into as some others do, the statistic that everybody's using is those 29 reps were more than what offensive tackle Joe Thomas put up. Future Hall of Fame offensive tackle Joe Thomas when he was at the Combine. He also put up more than offensive tackle Orlando Brown, who struggled on the bench press and may find himself out of day 1 and day 2 because of his poor showing at the Combine. But Sacrum Barkley outbenched a lot of guys. He had a 41-inch vertical, and he ran a 4.4 flat 40-yard dash. What I would like you to do when you think of Saquon Barkley is don't think of Saquon Barkley, the Penn State running back, and use your Penn State bias. What I would like for you to do is look at Saquon Barkley as the collegiate running back and look at him in the spectrum of college running backs, not just this year, but in the past 10 years. Or maybe go even further back than that. Go to the past 15 years. Because when you think of Saquon Barkley, you think of guys that will have immediate and long-lasting impacts in the NFL. Adrian Peterson comes to mind. Darren McFadden comes to mind. Reggie Bush comes to mind. So you have a mix of successes and failures in those three names. Adrian Peterson is a guy who's rushed for over 2,000 yards in a season, may be a future Hall of Famer. Darren McFadden's a guy who's had some success. He's been kind of a journeyman over the last 5 years. He's been with the Dallas Cowboys, the Oakland Raiders. He's had some success, but not great success. Then you have a guy like Reggie Bush, similar status. He's been with the Dolphins. He's been with the Saints. He was with the 49ers, and he was with the Detroit Lions. And he had moderate success, up and down seasons, but he was more successful in college. What separates Saquon Barkley from Darren McFadden and Reggie Bush and puts him more in the category of Adrian Peterson? Well, I'll tell you what separates Saquon Barkley from the other two guys and puts him in the realm of Adrian Peterson. Saquon Barkley is a complete running back who will carry the ball 200-plus times in his rookie season. He's a guy that, if needed, could catch 40 to 50 passes out of the backfield as well. He's also a guy, if needed, could return kicks and punts because he is probably and likely going to be the best athlete on your team. And you saw it at Penn State. He was the best athlete on offense. He was the best athlete on special teams. So what does Saquon Barkley do exceptionally well that makes him stand out and makes his combine numbers real as opposed to guys that were combine wonders and didn't necessarily pan out? Because we in Philadelphia have seen maybe the greatest combine wonder of all time in Mike Mamula. Well, Saquon Barkley has this very extremely rare combination of speed, shiftiness, and strength. I mentioned the fact that he put up 225 nearly 30 times. But let's not even think about that. Let's go back to prior to the 2017 season in August when the guys were doing their lifting workouts at Penn State, and you saw him squatting immense amount of weight. You saw him clean a ridiculous amount of weight. The guy is so strong and so physically demanding. And pair that with the fact that he has footwork out of the backfield and shiftiness in the open field, unlike many that we've seen over the last 15 years, unlike few that we've seen, that make him that can't-miss first-round top 5 pick and put him into consideration as the number 1 overall pick to the Cleveland Browns come this April. I'm in the boat, and this isn't me as a Penn State fan or a Penn State writer. This is me as an observer of the NFL draft and the teams that are set up in such a way. You heard me say it earlier. I'm in the boat where I would, if I were the Cleveland Browns, take Saquon Barkley number 1 overall. While they could use one more defensive player, they could use their quarterback, the fact that they have 1 and 4 allows them to take Saquon Barkley at 1, again, with the knowledge that the Colts are very likely not going to be drafting a quarterback at 3, that you have the ability, or at 2, you have the ability to take Saquon Barkley at 1, watch the Colts take a guy like maybe Bradley Chubb, maybe a guy like Quentin Nelson to shore up their offensive line. Maybe they take a guy like Minkah Fitzpatrick at 2 to shore up their defense. But the Colts will not, assuming that they believe that Andrew Luck is ready to go, and they have a little bit of faith in Jacoby Brissett to play, that they're not going to take a quarterback at 2. So that leaves the New York Giants at 3 with their ideal player in Saquon Barkley off the board, so they'll take a quarterback. So they take a quarterback. They take Josh Rosen, they take Josh Allen, they take Sam Darnold. They have their pick of the lot, and they can get any quarterback that they want. But after that, it's the Cleveland Browns back at 4. So the Browns say, well, we didn't get X quarterback, but there are Y, Z, and maybe even, I guess, W you would call it because I overshot my letters, if you wanted to take a shot at a guy like Baker Mayfield. So the Browns have a plethora of options with 1 and 4 to take Saquon Barkley with the number 1 overall pick. They now have Saquon Barkley in the backfield, along with Isaiah Crowell, who could be a very good change of pace guy, and Duke Johnson, who, by the way, is a fantastic pass catcher out of the backfield. You could bring back a split back formation and put Saquon Barkley and Duke Johnson behind the quarterback, whomever that may be, and then all of a sudden, you have 5 pass catchers on the field. You have 2 receivers, a tight end, and 2 running backs who can catch the football. That's going to be a mismatch for a lot of defenses. Because contrary to popular belief, and you just assume that the Browns stink, they didn't win a game, they have to have a bad offensive line. That's not the case. The Browns' offensive line is really good. Like we said, future Hall of Famer Joe Thomas, he'll be coming back off the injury. Joel Bitonio is still there. They've got a decent offensive line. I know the loss of Alex Mack last season was a hurt, but they've got a good enough offensive line where they can get a running back, they could get a quarterback. Now you have 2 starting caliber players on your offense that you did not have last year. So Saquon Barkley very well could be the number 1 pick in the draft. And if he's not number 1, I would assume that he's going to go at number 2 to the Indianapolis Colts. They didn't re-sign Frank Gore. They don't have intentions of re-signing Frank Gore. So you have left in that backfield is Marlon Mack. And you pair Saquon Barkley and Marlon Mack, now you have a very young and electric backfield to pair with Andrew Luck, despite the fact that your offensive line is still pretty putrid. But at least you've got your back now, and you've got your 2 backs under rookie deals that could cause problems for the AFC South, which is a good defensive conference with the Jags and the Texans and the Titans getting better each year. So you need to be able to run the football. Last thing on Saquon Barkley before I wrap this show up. If you've ever gone on NFL Network, on CBSSports.com, and you read the strengths and the weaknesses, draft projections, what the scouts and general managers are telling you about certain players. If you've ever dived in to the player comparisons, and they generally compare them to guys that are already in the NFL or guys that were, the same caliber player in the NFL comparably to this player that they're breaking down. And often, if you've ever noticed this, and it's something I've noticed frequently, because I read these things like they're novels, if you've ever noticed the fact that when you get an NFL player comparison, the comparison is generally lesser than what you would expect. And what I mean by that is, you have a guy like Josh Allen, who is a strong-armed, extremely large quarterback coming out of a less than stellar conference and playing for a less than stellar team because he wasn't that big name recruit, so he went to Wyoming. You have a guy like that, right? And I'm trying to find his comparisons right now, and of course my phone is all of a sudden kind of shutting down on me, but I'll get back to that. You have a guy like Josh Allen who's probably, I bet you, his prospect comparison is not going to be Carson Wentz, despite the fact that they have similar traits. And it shouldn't be, because Josh Allen is not Carson Wentz. And here we go. I have it up now. So Josh Allen's player comparison is former Washington quarterback and Tennessee Titan Jake Locker. And I was extremely high on Jake Locker. I thought he was going to be a great quarterback. And injuries derailed his career, and he was less talented than I thought he was. But that's the case. Josh Allen, who could be a top 10 pick, is being compared to a guy that had an average NFL career by average NFL standards. But when you look at Saquon Barkley's NFL comparison, it isn't a guy that had a good career. It's not a guy that had a great career. It's a guy that many would consider a top 3 running back of all time. Some consider him the greatest running back of all time. Because Saquon Barkley's NFL comparison is Barry Sanders. Now think about that for a second. Maybe the most gifted athlete at the running back position of all time. Maybe the shiftiest running back of all time. And if you remember, and obviously I was a little young when Barry Sanders was in his heyday, but I've watched a ton of film on Barry Sanders. And if you remember Barry Sanders, either watching him live or the same thing that I've had watching a ton of film, those Lions' offensive lines were terrible. They were absolutely awful. Plays would break down before whomever the quarterback was, whether it was Rodney Peete or Scott Mitchell or the plethora of quarterbacks that the Lions ran out in the 1990s. They never had any talent around Barry Sanders, but he would make guys miss on his own. He was a human highlight reel. He was the video game controller. And Saquon Barkley is very similar to Barry Sanders. I don't want to say that Saquon Barkley is going to have the career that Barry Sanders did because you can't predict that. It's not something you can say, well, this guy's going to be one of the top 5 greatest running backs of all time. But the comparison is enough to get you into the hype train of Saquon Barkley being the number 1 overall pick and helping the Cleveland Browns resurrect the team from the ashes. It's a team that won 0 games last year. It's a team that over the last 2 seasons is 1-31. There's only up to go from here. We thought that was the case 2 years ago, and they went from 1-0. So now there is only up to go from here. You draft Saquon Barkley at 1. You draft your quarterback at 4. All of a sudden, you go from a 0-win team to at least a 4 or a 5-win team, and it's still not a good prospect to be 4-12 or 5-11, but the progression is there. And if you can go from 0 to 4 wins or 0 to 5 wins, most franchises would consider that a successful transition season. Think about it this way. When the Eagles finished the 2016 season 7-9, a lot of us said, if this team could make themselves a 9-7 team, a 10-6 team, fringe playoffs, maybe win the division, maybe get in as a wild card, we would have said 10-6 would have been a very successful step forward. Now, 13-3 and a Super Bowl victory is not what many of us predicted. But a lot of us said 9-7, 8-8, 10-6, maybe get into the playoffs if they win their divisional games. Who knows? It might happen. So for the Cleveland Browns to say, go from 0 to 4, that's a huge upgrade. That's a massive upgrade, and I think that they would take it. And if it were the Eagles who just won 0 games and they had the 1st and the 4th pick, and they were able to draft a guy like Saquon Barkley at 1 and still get Josh Rosen at 4, or still get Sam Darnold at 4, or get Baker Mayfield at 4, Josh Allen at 4, and they improve from a 0-16 team to a 4-12 or a 5-11 team, I think a lot of fans would take that. They would jump on board right now to say we are in a progressive phase, and this is the direction that we're headed, and Saquon Barkley is part of the reason why that happened. So I'm all for Saquon Barkley being the number 1 overall pick in the draft, and it has nothing to do with the fact that he's a Penn State running back, and it has nothing to do with the fact that I write for Penn State and I root for Penn State. It has everything to do with the fact that Penn State's running back, Saquon Barkley, is the best player in this year's draft. And that's, again, not to say because he's a Penn State player. Because 2 years ago, I said that Ezekiel Elliott was the best player in the NFL draft. Sure, he came with some off-the-field concerns, but whoever was getting Ezekiel Elliott, and especially if the Dallas Cowboys with that stud offensive line were getting Ezekiel Elliott, they were getting the best player in the draft. Because to me that year, the 2 best players in that draft were Ezekiel Elliott on the offensive side and overall, and Jalen Ramsey on the defensive side of the ball. And you see what Jalen Ramsey does in the secondary for the Jacksonville defense. And this year, Sacrum Barkley is the best player overall. So why not take him at 1 if he's the best player? It's not like you have one need and you need to fill it. The Browns have a ton of needs. Running back being one of them. Quarterback being the other. You'd be able to get both if you take Barkley number 1. It was a little bit of an elongated segment. I went a little bit long, and I apologize, but kind of when you get on rants like this, that tends to happen. But that will shut the show down for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. As always, if you liked what you saw, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, if you liked what you saw on our Philly Sports Network page, please continue to read all of our amazing coverage that we have across the Philadelphia spectrum, whether it be the Flyers and Sixers in action right now, the Union in action as well, the Eagles in a transitional period, and the Philly season about to start. We've got a lot of talented writers at this site, so please check everything out that you've seen so far. Thank you once again for listening. We'll check you back here this time next week. We'll be back with more great Philadelphia sports action. For Trust the Podcast, I'm your host, Tyler Zulli, saying thank you. Have a great week.